Good morning. We are in John chapter 9. Oops, opened the wrong app. Hang on. There it is. Okay, John chapter 9. We were working our way. I think we basically got to the question. We didn't fully cover that. The question, of course, in this, just one question in this chapter, is in verse 35. The context here, of course, is Jesus he's healed this man who was born blind. That goes back to the beginning of the chapter. Just as he passed by, he saw this man that was blind from birth. Of course, the disciples asked this question, who sinned? Is he or his parents that he was born blind? And Jesus points out, sometimes people assume, and I think we discussed this at least to some extent last week or maybe even the previous week. Sometimes people assume when something bad happens to a person or persons that must be the result of sin. Somebody has sinned, and so they want to know, well, who has sinned that this fellow was born blind? And Jesus points out it's not due to anyone's sin, but contrary-wise, the works of God are going to be manifest in this fellow. And of course, when you study the book of Job, you learn this same thing, that you got Job's friends, that they assume Job has done some grievous thing. I mean, you must have, Job, for God to have his hand so heavy on you. They assume, like Job assumed, that God was doing this. It was from Satan. God is making a point to Satan, and there's this, in the book of Job, I've often said, I think it was Curtis Cates that I first heard say this, and it certainly is accurate, true, that really in the book of Job there is this, I don't know if you want to call it argument, showdown between God and Satan. Not that it's a fight in the sense of how we might think of that, but it's a dispute. Satan accusing God, well, you have bought Job's loyalty, his faithfulness. And God says, no, Job's a good man, and he'll serve me regardless. And Satan says, well, take away all that he's got, and you'll see, he'll curse you to your face. And God says, okay, you can take away all that he's got, but you can't lay your hands on him. So he does. Job, he stays faithful. Then you have Satan saying again to God, skin for skin, all that a man has, he'll give for his own life. Sure, he's still got his health. You take away his health, you'll see, he'll curse you to your face. And God says, okay, you'll see. you can't take his life, but you can take his health. And the whole time, here's Job, and he is caught in the middle, and he doesn't understand. He doesn't know. At least, again, assuming he wrote the book, and I think the evidence is there that he did. He doesn't know until he writes the book. But he assumed, Job did, that this was God doing this as well. And he doesn't understand it. But he says, I'm gonna stay faithful to God. I'm going to keep serving him. His friends say, Job, what have you done? You must have really sinned. And that's the idea here in John chapter 9 that these people have. Well, this guy must have done something. His parents must have done something, because here he is. He's been blind all his life. They assume bad things never happen to good people. And you don't have to live very long to realize in this life, in this fallen world, that sometimes bad things happen to good people. And you know what? The reverse is true too. Sometimes good things happen to bad people. It's just, that's part of living in this fallen world. That's why we sometimes sing, this world is not my home. We look for a place where bad things will never happen to good people. And there will be no worry about good things happening to bad people, because in heaven all rights, all wrongs are set right. We won't have to worry about that. But living in this world, that is going to be something that we see from time to time. So Jesus heals the man. Then people want to know, these religious leaders particularly, well, what happened? Well, he healed him on a Sabbath day. He must have broken the Sabbath, and we've been through that. And so they call the man on the carpet, and he tells them what happened. Then they ask his parents. It's almost, I guess it'd be more than almost. They pretty much outright accuse him. Well, you're just making this up. You weren't really blind. Is this your son whom you say was born blind? They say to the parents, and they say, look, it's our son. We can tell you that for sure. We can tell you he was born blind, but how he sees now, well, I don't know. You have to ask him. He's a big boy. And, of course, they're afraid of those religious leaders. They don't want to be put out of the synagogue. They keep asking the guy and pushing him, and they're trying to, in legal proceedings, this will be called leading the witness. Sometimes, you'll hear somebody, I object, Your Honor. He's leading the witness, and you're trying to get them to answer a certain way and pushing them toward that answer. And so that's, sometimes you'll see that in a courtroom, and the judge will say, objection sustained. He's leading the witness. You can't do that. Just ask and let him relate the facts. So they're leading the witness here. They're trying to get him to say that Jesus has done something wrong. He understands, this formerly blind man, Jesus didn't do anything wrong. There's no indication at this point that he's a believer in Jesus as far as a disciple, but he's just kind of, with them, he's sort of like from a common sense standpoint going, hey, look. In fact, at one point he's going to tell them, all I can tell you is I was blind. This guy came along. He healed me. And he sort of, to paraphrase, he says, why do you keep asking me? You keep asking me about this. Are you on the fence about becoming his disciple too? And that really, of course, upsets them. They really get angry at him. We know God spoken to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't know from whence he is. That's verse 29. And so, of course, he gets a little bit frustrated with him, this formerly blind man. Herein is a marvelous thing, that you know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. We know God hears not sinners. If any man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. Now here's this guy, and he's, again, no indication he's a disciple of Jesus. In fact, when you get down to the question that we're looking at here in this chapter, it seems pretty clear he doesn't understand that Jesus is the Messiah. He's not a follower of Jesus at this point. But he's kind of operating from a common sense standpoint. If this guy was not from God, how could he be doing such marvelous, clearly miraculous works? So that upsets them, of course. They answer and say, they make that accusation again. Thou wast altogether born in sins, verse 34, and dost thou teach us? And there's their arrogance. They're like, this guy could never teach us anything. He's just a common person. There's not a single person among us, then or now or ever, who knows it all. You can learn from a child, even as an older person. We can learn from anyone. We can learn just from looking at the world around us. But they have this arrogance. Oh, you're going to teach us? I heard of a preacher one time that was, he was at one time a gospel preacher, but he'd gotten way off course. And I can't remember who told me this, but I believe the fellow that told me was the one that kind of challenged this guy in one of his classes. It was a graduate school class, and I think it was in the Harding School of, I think it was called the Harding School of Religion, used to be there. They've since shut it down, but it's kind of strange. Harding University is in Searcy, but they had their graduate level studies in Memphis. And so I want to say it was one of my instructors that had told me this, or told us as a class this story. But this guy he'd gotten way off track out in left field, as far as doctrinally and stuff, and was teaching some really strange things. And this fellow kind of, he wasn't disrespectful, but he sort of challenged and pushed back on some of these things. And finally, this instructor says to him, what degrees do you have? Well, I have my bachelor's degree. I'm here working on my master's. Oh, so you don't even have a master's? Well, I have 2 masters and a PhD. So why don't you just keep quiet and let me do the teaching? And, as if because of my credentials, how dare you question me? Which he kind of said that to the wrong person, because the fellow kind of fired back at him and said, look, I'll tell you something, I can read the Bible. I got sense. And I know it's not saying what you're saying it's saying. But sometimes people have that mentality. Like, oh, you can't teach me. You're just, you're down here, I'm up here. And that's the attitude that they betray here, these religious leaders. And they say, oh, you are, and they make this accusation of being born in sin. Again, that idea that, well, you were blind, so you must have done something wrong. Born in sin. The Bible doesn't teach that. And so they cast him out. And that's where we left off last week. And I mentioned this last week. We want to get the context because it's so important with all of these questions. But remember the context leading up to this. Jesus he went to this feast in chapter 7. He went up later. His brothers kind of almost mockingly say, go up to this feast. Hey, you're the big shot Messiah. Go up and show yourself to everybody. And the text tells us their inspired comment that they didn't believe on him at that time. Now, some of them will come around later. But Jesus goes up later to the feast. He doesn't go up with all the crowds. And so he goes to this feast. He's challenged by some of these religious leaders. He teaches. And, here's Jesus. He's trying to, that's part of why he came into this world, to teach and to make known God, the Father, to humanity. But in the midst of that, he's constantly getting interrupted, sometimes literally interrupted as he speaks, by some of these religious leaders who want to challenge him. That's frustrating as a teacher. It's never frustrating, at least for me as a teacher, if somebody has a question and they say, hey, okay, hang on, can you clarify this? Or here's an additional thought. But if, you can imagine if you're teaching a class or if you're just addressing a group of people and somebody just interrupts and says, oh, yeah, but, and they want to challenge you. It's not that you mind being challenged, but there's a right way and a wrong way to do that. I think we understand that. They didn't do this the right way. So they interrupt him, they're challenging him, and so he's dealing with that. At one point, they send officers to arrest him. Of course, they come back and they say, never man spake like this man. In chapter 8, they get really nasty with him. We saw that context where they even, it just basically all but come out and say, it's very clear, they imply he was born of fornication, mocking the virgin birth. Where's your father, Jesus? And when you get to chapter 9, as I mentioned last week, he's had a bad day. I mean, it's been a bad day, and, someone might be tempted to walk right by this man who was blind and say, I don't have time for this. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to fool with this. But Jesus did, and he heals him. And it's interesting because after Jesus heals him, he sort of disappears from this, from the text after that, because they, after Jesus tells them, verse 11, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's when he's recounting it. Verse 7 is where Jesus says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. So he goes, he washed, and he came seeing. Then it's like Jesus just, we don't read about him again until all the way down here in verse 35. Because they're really after the guy who had been healed. They want to know who did this, what's going on. He healed on the Sabbath. Oh, he must not be of God. And Jesus has already addressed this. He's addressed it numerous times about healing on the Sabbath. That's no violation of the Sabbath. It's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. But again, just understanding that background, that context, that he's had a tough day. And he heals the man. Maybe he tries to kind of escape the crowd, but then they cast the man out. I said this last week, I've said it numerous times before. In their culture, this was kind of the ultimate. I mean, to be cast out of the synagogue, who you have left? I mean, that was all their friends, all their family. He's alone. And all that is just to say, verse 35 opens up with, Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And when he had found him, and that phrase, when he had found him, what does that, we talked, what was it, last week, I think, in the morning sermon about implication in Scripture. What is the implication of that phrase? He went and found him. We went looking for him. Jesus didn't just chance upon him. Oh, well, we meet again. No, he went after him. He knew they just kicked him out. And this guy is probably, I think it's safe to say, surely, kind of devastated. Maybe he might even be angry, but at the same time, even if he's angry, frustrated, he still has to be thinking, well, what do I do now? My family, they're going to have to be careful how they deal with me so that they don't get in trouble, and they're going to be cautious about that. Who knows, he may have been right there and heard his own parents say, well, we know it's our son.